History in Israel, a new unity government, and Benjamin Netanyahu becomes the first sitting prime minister to go on trial for corruption. Hello, I'm Mike Walter, sitting in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. Amid the coronavirus pandemic, a new unity government, and controversial plans to annex part of the West Bank, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu went on trial this week for bribery, fraud, and breach of trust. Two of the charges have to do with allegedly buying himself favorable press, and the third for allegedly receiving illegal gifts from a rich donor. He's repeatedly denied the allegations, calling them a witch hunt. The trial comes a week after a new unity government was sworn in, pairing Netanyahu with his chief rival, Benny Gantz. Under the power-sharing arrangement, Netanyahu remains prime minister for the next 18 months before handing over the reins to Gantz. In the interim, Gantz serves as defense minister and has the new title of alternate prime minister. There's a lot to talk about, so let's get right to our panel. Amat Azael is the Jerusalem Post senior commentator and a research fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute. Omar Badar is a human rights advocate and a member of the Arab American Institute's National Policy Council right here in Washington, D.C. With us from Rockville, Maryland is Dan Arbel. He is a 25-year veteran of the Israeli Foreign Service and currently serves as a scholar in residence at American University Center for Israeli Studies. And Mitchell Barak is an Israeli pollster and political analyst in Jerusalem. Mitchell, why don't I start with you? Netanyahu, just as defiant as ever. It's kind of interesting to look back on history when Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert was mired in scandal. There was this opposition leader. He said this, I want to get the quote just right: when a leader is neck deep in investigations, he has no moral mandate to make crucial decisions. Bit of irony, the opposition leader at the time was Netanyahu. Olmert did resign. Netanyahu decided he didn't want to. So let's start there as the first point, and then also kind of get into the weeds for us a little bit, kind of describe what the charges are he's facing.
Well, Netanyahu is facing a number of corruption charges in different cases. In each of the cases, they have the state prosecutor has some very strong witnesses, people that have worked closely with Netanyahu, that were on his staff, that were confidants, that have turned state witness. They have 333 witnesses in the case, and more than 20,000 documents in just one of the three cases. So it seems to be a pretty strong case. If you would ask Netanyahu, I can't answer for him, but certainly, the phrase that all animals are equal, some are more equal than others, would apply. But I think here he's portraying himself as being, the subject of a witch hunt, of that the left of center, that the elitists in the country are trying to bring down the government, bring down Netanyahu, because they couldn't do it in the ballot box. They couldn't do it on Election Day, not in the last three elections, not in the elections 4 years ago. And so this is the way that they've decided to rid the state of Netanyahu. So he really believes that he is fighting for democracy, that he is fighting for justice. And at the same time, he's come out and he's lambasted and criticized the police and the attorney general and many people along the way, which is sort of a scary thing that, the prime minister is publicly shaming or publicly questioning the very people that are supposed to uphold the law.
And we'll get to that just in a little bit. But Dan, I want to ask you about this decision of his to stay on. I mean, it's not just Olmert, but Yitzhak Rabin also resigned when he was faced with controversy. It's surprised that he is kind of staying as vehement as he is and fighting this with such vengeance.
This is unprecedented, absolutely, and but he's shown, as he's called by many Israelis, the magician. He's been able to pull this off for such a long time. In the beginning, ridiculed the actual allegations, and then as time goes by, with him going up a notch in the legal procedure, he just keeps on getting more support and more public support. And his tactics of accusing the deep state or the leftist elite and so on and so forth seems to be working and appealing to many of his base and outside his base. And if accurate polls coming out today show that he has wide support, and actually 42% of Israel's public believe that this that his accusations of this being that he's being scapegoated is true. So he's leaning on this wide public support to continue with his process, hoping that at a certain point that he won't need that anymore, and he'd be able to get away from any further prosecution in the future.
Of course, he's got a lot else going on. You know, we're looking at this new unity government. It was just sworn in about a week ago. And when you look at governments across the world right now, they're dealing with a lot, with the pandemic, economies that are shattered, Israel no different. But then, Dan, you also have this unlikely pairing of him and Gantz. How workable is this going to be?
Yeah, it's in its early stages right now, and the first few days haven't been exactly smooth sailing. It's been quite rocky, and it's based on the principle of parity. Yet Netanyahu's bloc is 59 members, and Gantz's bloc is 19 members. So there's a imbalance here, which needs to be seen how this works out in the future, because obviously this numerical difference can be translated into decisions in the future that may lead to further tensions, further conflicts within the cabinet, leading perhaps to a decision at a certain point to go to new elections, perhaps in 6 months or a year. So it's very, very fragile, very, very sensitive at this point.
And Amatz, let me ask you more about this power-sharing arrangement, because it also has sort of a recipe for gridlock. You look at it, Gantz has veto power on some issues, not all. It's a bloated government, 36 ministers, 16 deputy ministers. It just seems like it'd be difficult and rather tough to navigate all of this. How is it going to work?
I think that the government's big opportunity is on the domestic front, since there is so much that needs to be done urgently in the wake of the pandemic. And for this government is perfectly equipped to perform. And in the better case scenario in which it lasts, this is simply what emerges as the dominant agenda. Surely, judging by Netanyahu's declarations, he does not intend to work this way, because he says that he wants to move ahead with annexation of parts of the West Bank sometime in the summer, in other words, very soon. If he goes up that slope, I think he provokes this government's unraveling.
Interesting. And then you've also got this trial, the eventual verdict. How's that going to impact things?
Well, on that front, I think we're not going to see any breakthrough in the upcoming 12 or so months, simply because of the pace of trials, and because his own trial is extremely complex and it involves many cases and hundreds of witnesses. I don't think there's going to be any breakthrough or a turning point on the front of the trial itself. For at least a year. This is what the legal experts explained to us. The question is what the public will make of Netanyahu's situation until then. And my impression is that Netanyahu has exhausted his public backing, much as it is solid and much as he has proven, to everyone's astonishment, to endure election after election. This unique situation of his, he has not managed to pull in his direction any of the electorate that is past, that 50% of the electorate that he keeps pocketing almost entirely. And this will not change, and if anything, it will only be further eroded, because I think that the general impression among the people who did not vote for Netanyahu is that whether or not he is convicted, there is truth to the allegations against him, and he should not be prime minister. This is, of course, not what his supporters think, but there are only that many.
Omar, let me kind of follow up on Amatz talked about, of course, annexation of the West Bank. He's talked about this, wants to make this a major issue. But it's interesting, the UN Middle East envoy says Israel should abandon its threat to annex parts of the West Bank. Let's listen.
This runs counter to international law, violates existing agreements, and is not in line with international Security Council resolutions and Council conclusions of the European Union. For us, it's of utmost importance to uphold international law.
Omar, I want to get your reaction. What do you think?
I mean, sure. I think it's really important to use completely plain language to make clear what the concepts are that we're talking about. When we're talking about Israel annexing parts of the West Bank, we are talking about land theft, pure and simple. It is categorically illegal under international law. Israel has no claim to the West Bank any more than Israel has claim to Italy or France. I mean, this is just entirely preposterous, and that's why there's an entire mountain of UN resolutions saying that Israel cannot annex the West Bank, that Israel is obligated to withdraw from the occupied territories. And this is why there was universal condemnation of any move towards annexation, with the exception of the Trump administration. And I think it's because Trump probably has about as much respect for international law or any sense of basic decency as Netanyahu does. And so they found a match in each other, and I think this is the reason why annexation is about to move forward. But we should be clear also about the fact that annexation is a de facto reality on the ground. Israel has been grabbing the West Bank and taking up huge chunks of it for a very long time, and we're only talking about Israel merely declaring annexation as de jure for what is already a de facto reality on the ground. And it puts an end to the pretense that Israel is interested in a peace deal with the Palestinians and makes real the prospect of permanent apartheid, where Palestinians are locked down by Israel from every direction, living in complete and total subjugation under Israeli rule, and lacking the rights that other Israelis get to enjoy. And really, we should just be honest about what that arrangement actually is.
Mitchell, land theft, apartheid, your thoughts?
No, I mean, he always comes up with these great sound bites and these great accusations, but, you know, to the best of my recollection, I haven't read it in more than 20 years, but the Oslo Accords actually created a cooperation between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. It transferred certain responsibilities, administrative responsibilities. I believe that 96% of the Palestinian population in the West Bank is under the Palestinian Authority for health services, education service, security services, and so forth. And I think even somewhere in the Oslo Accord, it does say that Israel does have a connection to the West Bank. I mean, you know, besides the fact that for thousands of years we've been living in the region, it's, you know, mentioned many times in our Bible, but, you know, I haven't seen Italy in our Bible, but, you know, Omar didn't stop him from saying we have no connection whatsoever, as if we have, you know, no connection to
Mitchell,
Italy as well. So
Mitchell, I just want to be
this
clear.
is turning into, you know, somewhat of a silly debate of land theft, and you just said it. You said no connection to as much as to Italy.
That's not what I said.
Which
Let me repeat what I said. Mitchell, allow me to clarify. I don't want you to put words in my mouth. Allow me to clarify what I'm trying to say for a second. I'm saying there is obviously in the same way.
I heard what you said.
Allow me to clarify. Well, clearly you have not, since you're putting words in my mouth. In the same way that there's clearly a Muslim connection to Jerusalem and there's a Christian connection to Jerusalem, those don't mean that Saudi Arabia can take Jerusalem and claim it as a Saudi city, or the Vatican can claim Jerusalem as a Vatican city. In the same sense, there's no question that there is a very deep, meaningful Jewish connection to the West Bank, but that doesn't change the fact that international law says this is Palestinian land that Israel has no political authority to claim, and those are very different things.
But wait a second, in early I know he just took my, I mean, but in 1967, I don't think it was considered Palestinian land. I mean, I'm pretty sure it was Jordanian. So it's nice that the Palestinians have worked in there. It just becomes a silly conversation because there are agreements that talk about the status of it. There are agreements and security cooperation, and that the fact that the two sides, the Palestinians and the Israelis, agreed in the Oslo Accords to start negotiations to discuss what would be the future of it, which includes settlements and it includes other places and some facts on the ground or some places that are there. So, you know, to ignore that and use terms like apartheid and land theft and things like that, it's a very silly way to present your argument.
We're going to have to move on because we could get bogged down on this for quite a while. So let me
clarified it by, you know.
Okay. Mitchell, I think you made your point, and Omar, we've heard from you as well. Dan, well, actually, let me ask Amatz this question. Let's talk about Netanyahu and the 3 Ps. He's the prime minister. He's also quite a populist when it comes to the judiciary, kind of beating up on them. But one thing he is not is a poodle. He says his opponents want him to be an obedient right-wing poodle. He says he is not a poodle. Let's listen to what he had to say.
What stands for trial today is the attempt to thwart the people's will, the attempt to topple me in the right wing. For over a decade, the left hasn't managed to do it in the polling stations. So in recent years, they found a new patent. Members in the police force and in the state attorney's office have joined forces with the left-wing newspapers. I call them the Just Not Bibi bunch, in order to set me up with ludicrous and hallucinatory cases.
So some are saying he's waging war against the courts and the court of public opinion, but this can be very damaging to the country's trust in the courts. What's the overall impact of this?
Well, it certainly resonates among his own following, a broad circle, social circle that takes his allegations at face value and adopts them. However, there is an equally large swath of Israeli society that totally dismisses all this rhetoric and the argumentation that underpins it. And when I add up all these elements of the picture, I indeed say for the record, and have been writing for a long time, that Israel has arrived because of Netanyahu at a constitutional crisis, and we will need ultimately some kind of a constitutional convention that will change the way society here looks at the judiciary and vice versa, and at the same time also reconsider the relationship between the branches here. Israel did not come into being the way, for instance, the United States came into being, whereby independence was first won and then government was built very slowly and leisurely and peacefully. Over here we had a war situation, and therefore all these very important foundations of government were largely improvised. And now we will need some serious construction almost from the foundations. And I'm afraid that as long as Netanyahu is there, having chosen the abrasive path that you've just rightfully cited, this will not be possible to launch. But after his departure, it will be urgent, imperative, and hopefully also will happen.
Dan, is that how you see it as well?
You know, I would, my friend Amotz, I wish I could be so optimistic. I feel that certainly Israeli democracy, Israeli democratic institutions are eroding, and I think that Netanyahu very deliberately and he's very much aware of what he's doing to get out of this trial, to lead the charge against the Attorney General, the police, and other law enforcement and justice officials and processes is taking the country in a very negative direction that may, God forbid, lead to an outbreak of violence and a slippery slope to an inner conflict which we've not seen the likes of since the establishment of the state. So as much as I would like to see the institutions prevail and the trial reaching an end, and I do hope that he's innocent. He may come out innocent, but I don't know if we'll have that luxury of having this play out till the end. And it's very, very worrisome to see where Israeli society is heading to, the animosity, conflicts, and deep disconnect between various parts of Israeli society that are tearing very, very fabric of it, and I'm worried about that.
And Dan, Gantz has now vowed to protect the judiciary from attack. It's kind of putting him in an awkward position as well. How does he navigate it?
So, you know, he's got a very tough balancing act. On one hand, he's campaigned on Just Not Bibi. Then he joined Netanyahu's government. At the same time, once he's already made that huge leap and is also sharing power with Netanyahu, he does have a very important job in protecting those democratic institutions which I referred to earlier. And so he needs, and he has been doing it, perhaps not forcefully enough, but standing up to the attacks of Netanyahu and his supporters against the democratic institutions, and stating time and time again that rule of law is critical, and Israeli democracy is before anything else, and is above any personal vendetta or personal charges. And so he's got a role to play. He's started to do that, but he's got a lot more to do in the future.
Omar, 18 months can seem like a lifetime in politics, but once Gantz takes the reins as prime minister, do you see him as being more flexible with the Palestinians?
I don't see the prospect of Gantz becoming prime minister after Netanyahu is done as being a particularly positive shift. I mean, he spoke in favor of annexation himself. So it's clear that this unity government is in favor of moving in that direction, and I think that that looks inevitable at this point. It's just remarkable to me that when we talk about sort of the threat to Israeli democracy, nobody discusses the elephant in the room. We're talking about what the rhetoric about the rule of law and the courts and this and that. It's almost like talking about what the problems are with U.S. democracy under Jim Crow. I mean, yes, there are Palestinians that are divided in many different categories. Some are citizens of Israel who have some rights. They have some political rights. They can run for the Knesset. You have a portion of Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip who can't go in and out of the Gaza Strip without Israel's permission. And it's the same in the West Bank. Even the ones who are living under, Palestinian rule, so to, quote unquote, those are still people who cannot go in and out without Israel's permission. Those are still people whose access to water is denied by Israel. Israel diverts most of the water in the West Bank to the use of settlements. And the list goes on and on. And I think that if we're going to be honest about what is wrong with Israeli democracy, it is the fundamental issue that Palestinians exist on the same land. They do not enjoy the same rights and freedoms that Israelis enjoy. They cannot come in and out. They don't have the same freedom of movement that Israelis enjoy. And until that is fixed, no one can speak in any seriousness about the prospect of Israeli democracy. Democracy depends on the principle of one person, one vote, or a separate state entirely. And as long as Palestinians are denied a state of their own that is viable, that has its own borders and controls its own borders, and at the same time they're denied equal rights, we're living in a situation that I really don't think can even be described as a democracy at all.
Well, Amatza, you brought up this issue. How would you respond to what Omar just said?
Well, I have one question to Omar. If one man, one vote is so important, and what do you say about Mahmoud Abbas's failure to hold his own presidential election and since 2005?
Yeah, I think that's a real problem, and Mahmoud Abbas should be holding elections, but that in no way absolves Israel from continuing the occupation.
Isn't that the real problem then? I'm happy to hear you concede this. Isn't that the real problem?
It's not the real problem because Israel holds control over those territories, a lot more control than Abbas does. If Abbas goes away, the situation of Palestinians, the occupation doesn't end. But if the occupation ends, then sure, the situation in Palestine would look very, very different. And that's really at the bottom. The bottom line is Israel holds the control.
I'm not very happy that you're putting it this way because, Omar, let me help you. I'm happy you're making this distinction between the situation of the national conflict, what you call control, on the one hand, and democracy on the other. Don't confuse democracy with your real agenda, which is legitimate, which is about the relationship between Israel and the Palestinians. On the democratic issue, you cannot win. Set that aside. Now, concerning control, I actually want to say something in your favor.
Moving forward with annexation.
Carefully, okay?
How can you set it aside when Israel's moving forward with permanent hold of the West Bank?
I heard you out. Please hear me out. Listen to me carefully.
Okay.
The annexation idea, as Netanyahu is now promoting it, is very wrongly, in my view, seen by him as a continuation of what he's already done on the Golan Heights. On the Golan Heights, with American backing, he moved ahead with annexation, and it happened from the Israeli viewpoint flawlessly. And he thinks he can use that momentum by proceeding from there to the West Bank. I actually disagree with that calculation of his, and I think that in this roadmap of his, he's failing to consider the fact that the Golan Heights are devoid of any Palestinian population. There are some Syrian Druze over there, but they're not Palestinian. And the regional circumstances were that the local power that be, namely the Syrian government, was up to its neck in its own civil war. The timing, therefore, was also opportune. And the Russians who were in the neighborhood were also evidently quite fine with this. So that worked well for him on the Golan Heights.
All right. So
in West Bank, I think the situation is entirely different,
but
and
that's
that
the thing,
game plan won't work.
I think the problem is that you're looking at it purely through a strategic lens of whether this would be a good move or a bad move. When I think there's a deeper principle at work, which is the Golan Heights is Syrian territory that Israel is not entitled to take, and is the same with the West Bank. Leave the political calculus aside on whether this is a good move or a bad move strategically, and just deal with the underlying principle that Israel does not have the right to expand and take over territory that international law says does not belong to Israel.
All right. Gentlemen, we have to move on. Mitchell, I want to ask you about Gantz's motivations here, because a lot of people have called him a turncoat. but he said the people said to us, stop fighting amongst yourself and get to work for us. How is Gantz being seen in all of this?
Well, it depends who you ask. I mean, the people that were in his party that he kind of left in order to join Netanyahu are quite upset about it and think that it's a certain level of fraud or misleading the voter because they promised many, many times not to join with Netanyahu. At the same, at the same token, there are people that say that he's done a great thing and a very humble thing by, abandoning the principles that he had. And, in Israeli elections, I like to say Groucho Marx is a main philosopher. These are my principles, and if you don't like them, I have other principles. So, he's using a different set of principles, but at the end of the day, to a certain extent, it was a political suicide mission for him because he burned himself with a lot of voters for the next time around. But I think he felt at this point that there was no easy way out, that there's really no budget that's been passed in the Israeli government because we've been running on election campaign after election campaign. And with that, combined with the pandemic and the coronavirus, the country needs to have a government and it needs to move forward. So going to another election was just not going to be good for Israel. So I think he bit the bullet and decided that, it's time for him to take his half of the party and join the Netanyahu government,
Mitchell,
which a lot of people say was a very bold move.
Mitchell,
and, he did
briefly,
that.
if you can, because we're just about out of time, how do you see this playing out? Is there going to be a conviction, and what will be the legacy of Netanyahu?
And no one knows if there's going to be a conviction or not, and it's going to be very long way down the line. I think that Gantz got the better end of the deal, meaning for his 19 seats, he's got a lot of key ministries, half of the ministers, and he's actually slated to be prime minister. So, for right now, the government is working together. I think they're still, it's almost like a forced marriage. They're looking to, figure out how they're going to work together, all the different people, because they've been attacking each other the last year. But they're going to have to find a way to work together and keep this thing going. The trial is going to be going on in the background. I mean, I think the biggest thing for Netanyahu will be as the witnesses start to take the stand and some of the material comes out, it may be embarrassing for him and it may be not favorable for the Israeli public. But it's going to take a very long time for that trial to happen. And, we're already past the two major hurdles, meaning a year ago people were saying, he's going to be indicted and he can't serve as prime minister and he can't form a government. He's been indicted and he won an election, the second election after he was indicted, and they say he's going to start a trial. And that's an unprecedented thing. So now we're past that. We've started the trial. He has the indictment. Not only is he on trial, he's on trial for bribery while in office, unlike Olmert, who was on trial for something he did as mayor. We've passed all that, and a lot of Israelis are saying, it's a really complicated situation here. We need strong leadership.
Yeah.
This is not going to phase us because they elected him knowing all these things.
Yeah.
So we'll have to wait and see.
All right. Gentlemen, thanks for a lively discussion. Certainly appreciate it. And that is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for watching.